at this point, you're basically a veteran of shooting photos on your iPhone, and you want to take that next step. Maybe you just bought a new camera from some retailer or used on Craigslist, or you stole it from your grandpa's attic after he passed away. I don't know. You want to learn to use that camera. There's a burning passion inside you to point it at things and then look at those things later when you're not there. My name is Tanner. I have been a working photographer for 5 years, and I'm going to share 5 things, or 5 tips rather, that will help you feel a little more confident around your camera. So before we get into those 5 tips, what actually goes on when you're taking a photo in your camera? A lot of people just think you hit the button and then magic happens and then there's a photo. That's not what happens. Why would you think that, dude? So in almost every camera you have this thing called a shutter. When you click the button down, the shutter will lift up, light exposes onto your sensor, and then it closes, and that's your photo. Doesn't matter if you're shooting on a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or a film camera. The difference there would be it's exposing onto film and not a digital sensor, but you get what I mean. This probably isn't the best thing to do, but for sake of demonstration, there is your sensor. It's the most important part of your camera. It's where your megapixels are located. It is what the light hits. In every essence, it is essentially your image. You see how the shutter went down and then back up? That is what I was talking about. Press no, 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 go, 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 go. I'm sorry, go. Thank you, I love you. Here is a Canon 5D Mark II. It is a DSLR. I'll have another video explaining the differences between DSLR and mirrorless, but whatever. As you can see right there, there's a mirror. The mirror is going to lift up. Light will expose on the sensor, and then it will close. You see that? Wow. So, that leads me into tip number 1. Learn to shoot on manual. Every professional photographer shoots on manual. If you are a professional photographer and you don't shoot on manual, I don't like you. Just kidding. You can do what you want. But I highly recommend to shoot on manual. Why? Why is this man yelling at me, and why do I need to shoot on manual? I don't know why I'm yelling, and you need to shoot on manual because you are the photographer. If you don't shoot on manual, the camera is just guessing what to do. It doesn't know if you're going for a portrait, or a long exposure, or anything else. It doesn't know. You might get some good pics out of using the auto settings, but at the end of the day, you're just hitting a button. Now, let me get into what shooting in manual does. When you shoot in manual, you will control these 3 things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Aperture is how wide the hole in your lens can open to let light in. Now, it's a little tricky if you're not used to it, but a lower number on your aperture means you have a wider hole letting in more light. You have a wider hole. You have a wide hole. Now, a smaller aperture, like f/22, which is kind of extreme, it's a really tiny hole. It doesn't let as much light in, but you have a much wider plane of focus. Here I have my Sony a7 II. As you can see in the middle right there, that's where your aperture, or iris, is. So, I'm going to go ahead and close it all the way down to f/22. You see that? Not letting in a lot of light. And then I can open it all the way up to f2.8. That aperture is represented by an f number. See how right there in the middle it says f2.8? So, look how much darker my photo is getting the more I increase my aperture. Why do I need to change my aperture? Well, let's say you're doing a landscape, right? And you're on a tripod and it's nighttime and you want to do a long exposure. You're going to want to be at like f10, which is pretty small, because you want to get everything in the landscape in focus. Let's say you're doing a portrait of somebody and you want it to look really nice and professional and cinematic. Well, you probably want to be at like 2.8, 1.8, or even 1.4 to get that really nice background and make your photo look more professional. That is what aperture does. It is very important. It's the first thing that I look at when I'm judging what I should do for a photo. The second thing is shutter speed. Now, you know how I showed you the shutter opening and closing? Shutter speed is just how long it stays open for, and it's measured in fractions. 1/10, 1/100, 1/1000, 1/10,000, so on. I don't think it'll go much higher than that. But anyway, what does that fraction mean? That fraction is a fraction of a second. So 1/10 would be 1/10 of a second. It's open for 1/10 of a second. 1/100 is 1/100th of a second. That is faster than 1/10. 1/5000th would be much faster than 1/10 of a second. If you're getting into long exposures, you won't be using a fraction. It'll actually go into seconds. That's noted by quotation marks on your shutter. All right, if you look on that side, I'm at 1/50 right now. That's 1/50th of a second. If I move it this way, because this is a mirrorless camera, you're seeing the photo get brighter, but now I'm at 1.3 quotation, 1.6 quotation, 2 quotation. That means seconds. So 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 13 seconds. I'm assuming you know how to count. And you might be asking yourself, why would I have my shutter open for 10 seconds or 30 seconds? Well, that's how you get long exposures. I know you've all seen the photos where there's like a waterfall and it looks all smooth and dreamy. That's because whoever took that photo had their camera on a tripod, the shutter was open for 30 seconds, they probably had a neutral density filter, which makes everything a lot darker, on top of their lens, and then they capture the water actually moving, but everything else stays still, and it gives you that really cool effect. Same thing on all those photos you see of like Mulholland with the red lights traveling on top of the road. Those are just cars driving by and the camera, or capturing the light I should say. Shutter speed is also really important when you are doing action photography. Let's say you're shooting your high school's football game that is going on during a pandemic. You need to have a high shutter speed so when someone's running by, it freezes them in time. If your shutter speed isn't fast enough and it captures them actually running, they're going to blur. The third thing is ISO. ISO is pretty simple. It's represented by numbers, again. Most cameras will start at ISO 50 and go up to like ISO like 126,000. Now, if you've ever shot on film before, it's the same kind of thing as film speeds. The higher the ISO/film speed, the more noise or grain you're going to have. Now, if you like that, then that's great. ISO is just your camera digitally blowing up the photo. What I mean by blowing up is lighting up. Let's say you're in a situation where you have to keep your aperture at like 1.8 and then you have to keep your shutter speed at like 1/500th because you're shooting something that needs to do that, right? Well, let's say it's too dark. The only thing you can do is blow up your ISO. I tend to keep my ISO as low as possible, and I blow it up as a last resort because I like having smoother looking photos. If I want to add grain in, I can add it later in Lightroom. It's a lot harder to get rid of grain than it is to add it, in my opinion. Tip number 2 is that your lens is just important, if not more important, than your camera. The reason why is because lenses have different focal lengths and aperture ranges. You know a little bit about aperture right now from what I just said, but what you probably don't know is that kit lens that you bought with your Canon T7i or your Sony a6000, it has a really slow aperture range. For example, this is a Tamron 28-300 f3.5 to 6.3 lens. That is your focal length, 28-300. 28 is pretty wide, and then it zooms out to 300. That's an interesting angle I got there. This aperture is pretty, what we call, slow. 28 millimeters, the widest open that hole can be is 3.5. At 300 millimeters, the widest open that hole can be is 6.3. This lens is really good for daytime shooting if you want to get things far away from you, but it's not so good for something like portraits or shooting at night. This 35 millimeter prime lens is really good for street photography, and the benefit is that the aperture goes all the way down to a 2.8, but the trade-off is that it's stuck at 35 millimeters, so you can't zoom in or out, but you can open it up to a 2.8. So lenses that have a zoom range and a good aperture on them are going to cost a lot more because it requires a lot of engineering inside the lens to keep like the light at a 2.8 all the way through at anywhere from like a 24 to a 70 millimeter focal range. But anyway, as I was saying, the lens is going to make the biggest difference to your photos, more so than the camera. The reason I say this is because I used to work in a camera shop for about 3 years, or 3 or 4 years, and a lot of the people I would help would come in with their old like Canon T5i, and then they'd be like, oh, I'm thinking of upgrading to the T7, which is almost the same camera, maybe a couple more megapixels and a little bit better autofocus and maybe better video. But at the end of the day, the sensor is almost exactly the same as their T6i. And they'd been using their kit lens the whole time. What they don't realize is they could buy like a 85 millimeter 1.8, which I have right behind me, like this guy right here. This is a Rebel XS. It's extremely old, but I have a Canon Gold series, I guess you'd call it, 85 1.8 millimeter lens on it, and it still takes really good photos. You picked up your camera and it's a little older, or you bought it used and you only have that kit lens for it, you can really improve the quality of your photos by getting a decent lens. Get the Nifty 50 if it's a Canon, Nikon, or Sony. Every brand has their Nifty 50 that's most likely less than $250, and you can get some really cool photos out of it. Moving to my third point, don't be intimidated if your gear is not top of the line. Like I said before, this Rebel XS is old as shit. I could probably sell it for $5 and some chicken tenders. Don't be intimidated if something like this is all you can afford, because you're still going to get a really, really good result out of it, way better than any iPhone, even the new iPhone 12 with its ultra-wide camera coming out and its portrait mode can take. It's still incomparable because the sensor in this is so much bigger than any phone sensor. You could buy a 10-year-old camera and get better photos out of it than you will on any phone. That is a fact. Maybe not in 10 years. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm not a phone engineer. Moving on to my fourth tip. This one's a little broad, but it's have a decent idea on what you're going for when it comes to photography. So I mentioned that I worked in a retail camera shop for a while. I'm not going to say the name of it. The main question that I would ask all of my guests is, what kind of photos are you going to take? And if it's a person who had no experience whatsoever, 9 times out of 10 they would say, I don't know, and then they would point to a camera and go, does this one take good pictures? It is not the camera that takes good pictures, it is you that takes good pictures. A common misconception is that if you spend enough money, you'll have a camera and a lens that can do it all. Just one camera and one lens, and that's not true. There are so many different types of photography out there. Sports photography, landscape, wildlife, street photography, portrait, fashion, tons of things. The reason I say kind of have an idea of what you're going for is because it's going to end up saving you money in the end. Let's say you want to shoot portraits of people. If you really like taking photos of people, or you think you're going to like taking photos of people, whoever helps you when you buy your camera, you're going to know, like, hey, I want to shoot portraits. What's a good beginner setup for portraits? Or what's a good beginner setup for wildlife or street photography or landscape? Because there's no all-in-one solution. It's just not a thing. Even if you spend a shit ton of money on a camera, it's just not a thing. One thing to be said about this is the kit lenses are quite literally better than nothing. And kit lenses are the lenses that come with the beginner cameras, like a Sony a6000 or a6100 at this point. They're literally there for you to figure out where you are focal length wise. That will help base your next lens purchase off of that. I would never use a kit lens. I'd never use one. My fifth tip is to simply, if you are a beginner, you need to take your camera everywhere with you. Photography is an art form just like learning a musical instrument or dancing or painting or anything else. It requires practice. The difference about photography is that, you can't put your guitar on an auto setting and then play a song, or you can't put your fucking pencil on auto setting and draw something. Practice makes perfect. We all know that. You don't become a real photographer until you really understand what's going on. And by bringing your camera everywhere with you and constantly searching for new photos to take, you develop your photographer's eye. And that is the most valuable thing you can have. Photography is much more of an accessible hobby to start off with, especially if you're rich. You need to do it all the time. You need to carry your camera with you. Don't keep it in your car. That'd be bad, especially depending on where you live. Don't do that. Keep a good eye on it, but carry it with you all the time. Get a nice, new strap, and then just fucking take it with you, man. Fucking take it everywhere with you. And post your shit on Instagram. And don't make like a second Instagram that's like your name, photos, and then where you make a bio that says, I like taking pictures, and then you post 3 photos and leave it vacant for 3 months. Just post your shit on your main account. Like, I don't know why people have to have a separate account for like better photos. Like, this, I don't get it. Like, whatever. Bottom line is, take your camera with you everywhere because practice makes perfect. Even with a hobby like photography that seemingly seems easier than other art forms. Oh my god. Again, my name's Tanner. I'm going to be making a lot more videos and a lot more in-depth things about photography. If you like the video, let me know with a comment. If you feel inclined, go ahead and subscribe. It's free, I'm pretty sure. If you didn't like all this, then just flame me in the comments, dude. Just destroy me. Anyway, I hope I helped you guys out somewhat. If you have any questions, again, leave it down in the comments.